Welcome to The Kicker. I'm your host, Megan Greenwell. Today, we have an episode all about student journalism and the protections for student journalism, which is an issue near and dear to my heart because I started at my student newspaper in high school in the San Francisco Bay Area. My guest today is Eric Gustafson, who's the journalism advisor at Lowell High School in San Francisco. And Eric became famous in student journalism circles for filing a lawsuit against his employer after they removed him as the journalism advisor based on a bunch of stories they didn't like. He said, there are protections for me here in California State Education Code, and he actually won that suit. The final decision was struck just a week or so ago. So a super interesting conversation, I think, and I'm excited for you to listen to it. Eric Gustafson, welcome to The Kicker.
Thanks for having me. It's a pleasure to be here.
Well, I've been really excited about this interview, in part because I followed your legal case against SFUSD the whole time it was happening, in part because I am a product of high school journalism in the Bay Area, went to Berkeley High School, started my journalism career there, and was lucky enough to break a huge story there because I had the support of my advisor. So this is a very personal one to me. So I guess first, tell me about how you got involved in high school journalism, at Lowell, generally, all of that.
Yeah, it's something that was kind of a long time coming. I had a journalism career almost 20 years, from roughly 1995 until 2014-15. And at that point, I decided I wanted to return to the classroom right out of college. I had taught for a couple of years. I taught English in Germany, and I really liked being in a classroom setting. But the early 90s, mid 90s happened, and internet blew up, and I was able to do travel writing and do automotive writing, and I was able to just go down that path. And I was a little torn about that or teaching, and so I went all in on that. And then at a certain point, I decided, you know what, I'd really like to get back in the classroom. I'd like to see if I can really use the skills that I have. And the thing, I kind of took a leap of faith. I wanted to be a high school journalism teacher, but I didn't really do my full due diligence in that there are not a whole lot of high school journalism programs left. And so after I got my teaching credential in English at San Francisco State, I'd spent 2 years teaching English. And after that, I was able to get a job at Lowell, and there's not many position openings, and I was lucky in some ways to get that position, especially since it's a program that's been around so long. So I was fortunate, and quickly turned into really kind of a dream job for me.
So before we get into the details of your case, can you set the scene a little bit for me here? I know what Lowell High School is, but a lot of our listeners don't, and it's a pretty unique high school, and I'm interested in what it is and also what that means for what kind of journalism program it is.
Yeah, so I think it's kind of an old term, and it's a magnet high school. That's kind of a term from decades ago, but it is and has been for a long time, not forever. But it is a school that you have to test to get into, and so it's definitely a high achieving academic school. There was a 2-year period where they went to a lottery system, which is the basic San Francisco unified system of acceptance into the school. But yeah, it is an elite high school. There's just a few of them left in the United States, but it's definitely a public school. But there is an atmosphere of achievement. There's a lot of AP classes that are offered. I think we offer more AP classes than any other school. So, I think that might some ways be separate from the journalism program. But I think, there's some real high achieving students that approach the journalism program kind of like they approach their AP classes. And they're really committed, really intelligent students. And a lot of the students don't necessarily want to become journalists, and I don't present the program that way. A lot of them are off to do other things, but I'm fortunate to have students that do really put their all into the classes that I've taught there.
And tell me a little bit about how it works. They have to take a Journalism 1 class before they join the staff of the newspaper. Is that right?
That's right. Yeah. So there's a Journalism 1 class, and then Journalism 2 is the production class. And they used to be completely separate classes. And unfortunately, when I started, there was I taught 3 periods of journalism, and that has been reduced to 2. And budget cuts. It's an elective class, so it's been hit by all electives in California, and especially San Francisco Unified, have been hard to get funding for. But yeah, Journalism 1 is mostly, it's a writing class, and they're learning we start with a profile article and do a news feature, but it is a reporter training class. And then Journalism 2 is the production class. But many students come in that already have skills. So for the photographers, illustrators, although there is instruction in those fields, those positions, people come in as Journalism 2 students, and they have to submit a portfolio of their photography or their artwork, and then the photo or illustration editors look at their work and then invite them into the program or not.
And one of the other special things about doing high school journalism in California, and this gets to the root of your case, is that there is a section of California Education Code, Section 48907, that says basically that guarantees freedom of the press applies to high school journalists. 18 states have some sort of law protecting student journalists, but California's is unquestionably one of the strongest. And it protects both the students doing the journalism and their advisor. Says an employee shall not be dismissed, suspended, disciplined, reassigned, transferred, or otherwise retaliated against solely for acting to protect a pupil exercising their right to freedom of speech and of the press. We hear stories all the time from states that don't have those kinds of laws where their student newspaper gets completely shut down because they published a story that the administration didn't like. This is a very common thing. The Student Press Law Center is great about tracking these cases. Tell me a little bit, even before you got to this legal case, what it's like to run a student journalism publication, under those circumstances where you do have such fierce protections.
Well, obviously, it's a wonderful thing to have. And I make every semester, even though students are in the program for a year, every semester I go over 48907 and make it clear what their freedoms are. But I also make it clear to the students what they have to fulfill in order to their responsibility, and make it clear to them that with that freedom comes the responsibility to not publish libelous information, and make it really clear to them that, yes, they're an independent publication, but as an independent publication, they can be sued. Like, I really make that clear to them because, they're a student publication, but really, for all intents and purposes, they're not that much different than the San Francisco Chronicle or the San Francisco Examiner in that way. The only provision that's a little bit different is that I can step in if they are going to foment some kind of revolution on campus, or it's there's certain other aspects of that law. But part of it too, it's really clear, is that I can't tell them what to do, and I can't tell them what not to do. And I think that's one of the things that I found out through this case, is that a lot of my colleagues didn't really understand that. Like, I can't tell them they cannot publish an article. All right, there's obviously, again, if they're inciting violence or something, that I can step in. But the other side of that coin is that I can't tell them what to put in, and I think there's assumptions around that, them being high school students, me being the teacher, that people don't quite understand that nuance.
So, what does that mean for the editing process? Talk us through how that works a little bit. Are you reading stories? Are you editing them? Are you saying you can't publish this line because it could be libelous? How does that all work?
Yeah, I mean, I definitely read every piece of content that they create, and I'm in the process first of for the. I think it's important to lay out that it's a student publication like most, and Instagram is one of the main outlets, and we have a website, but we do have a print magazine, a news magazine that comes out 5 times a year, 2 in the fall and 3 in the spring, and that's definitely the focus of most of the efforts are on that, and things are a little more formalized, like in terms of pitching. So every student, whether they're a reporter, editor, or photographer, they have to pitch an idea for the magazine, and it's a formal process. I'm there. The editors in chief are in that process, and I give feedback. It's they submit the pitch, and I give them feedback on that as well in a Google Classroom setting. But when it comes down to deciding what goes into the magazine, when the editors are making their final decisions, I purposely remove myself from that discussion. And I think that's really important. I say my piece, what's newsworthy, what's not, and try to inform their decision. But I'm not in the room when they make that decision. And, I try not to be putting my foot on the scales in that way. But yeah, once that decision is made, I am giving them feedback on sourcing and giving them feedback on the text when it's coming in. I'm making sure that they have enough sources, and I'm holding them to their responsibilities as journalists.
So, the kerfuffle with your role as advisor, in some sense, started in February 2023 when the student journalist published an article called Obtainable and Addictive, that was about student drug use at Lowell. I read it and it was a pretty remarkable piece of student journalism. They had multiple students, anonymous but on the record, uh, talking about buying drugs in the school bathrooms, all of these things. Um, can you explain a little bit the process of that article coming out and then what happened after it came out?
Yeah, I think it went through the same process. It was someone pitched the idea, and usually in those pitching sessions, the editors and myself were asking, who are you going to talk to? A pitch doesn't go through unless someone already has sources. That's part of the process. So I think in that case, there were I can't remember if it was 1 or 2 reporters that pitched that, but they had sources. It wasn't just an idea. Yeah, I think the students were well aware of the fact that it was a controversial issue, and part of there's a problem at that point. There was Adderall was really difficult to come by, and we had some students, and there's one point we're thinking of doing a story just about that, of how some ADHD suffering students were having a hard time getting their medication, and so that kind of fed into that story of that was one of the drugs that was available and being sold on campus.
So then what happened after the story came out?
Well, after the story came out, the principal, who I had given a heads up to a few days before publication, I said, Dr. Jones, this story is coming out. The administration had been interviewed in that story, and their statements about how it's dealt with on campus had been discussed. He had myself and the 2 editors-in-chief come into his office, and he told us that he supported student journalism, but talked about how this story had a big impact on the whole campus community, faculty, students, parents included, and that it had caused him a lot of work in terms of dealing with especially parents, but also other community members. And in light of that work that he and his staff was required to do in response, that he'd like a little lead time. that he'd like to know of such stories further in advance, even though I had given him a heads up. So he asked to get the publication a week in advance. And going into that meeting, those student editors were very well aware of their rights under 48907. The students got back to him by email and were gracious and respectful, and we basically validating his concerns about the impact of the article, but said, based on our rights, we're going to decline that request, and we're not going to give it to you in advance. And I think the students saw what was going down. I mean, he wasn't asking for prior review, but he was asking for the publication in advance. So, it was pretty clear what was going on there, and fortunately, he didn't cause. He accepted their offer. He tried some other things to get the student editors into kind of a campus review that he was trying to get students, some students that were in student government, and he wanted the journalists to get involved in this, kind of having meetings with them. And they didn't go for that either, because it was kind of clear that he was wanting to get ahead of things. He wanted to control messaging more. And the students just, again, respectfully said, decline that offer to be part of that kind of campus community review. I can't remember which term he asked for it. But there's no doubt. I mean, that principal who's no longer there, he was cordial and things, and it went fine. But it was clear when you get called to the principal's office and the principal is asking you for things, the power dynamics are abundantly clear.
The email that the students wrote him is in the court documents.
Right.
It's a really terrific piece of writing. They are super professional, explain their case very clearly. I read it and was like, go students. But I'm interested from your perspective, you're not the decision maker. They are. You've also been a journalist for a long time and clearly have opinions about prior restraint and the concept of the principal weighing in advance. So how do you sort of negotiate, I have opinions here and I am very experienced in this field, versus it's ultimately your decision?
Well, it's very clear that, I wasn't coaching them, and I wasn't telling them what to do, because it's the same thing. I'm not telling them what to put in the publication. But going into that meeting, I think we did have a refresher course on 48907. And so in that case, I had complete faith in their decision process, and I didn't feel the need to intervene in any way. I was very proud of that email. But they didn't, I didn't edit that email. I wasn't involved in that process.
So then, almost a little more than a year and a half later, there's another big article published in print. The article is called Invasive and Inappropriate, and it's about verbal harassment and inappropriate behavior from teachers. And it is a similar article in a lot of ways, right? There are a lot of students not using their real names, but speaking very candidly about their experience. There is response from the administration. It's, again, an impressive piece of student journalism. So I'd love to hear a little more about, where that article came from, and how that ended up being, a fairly big piece for the Lowell.
Yeah, it's a piece that there's been maybe a couple of times over the 10 years or close to 10 years that I've been there where that had come up. And okay, if you're going to do this, you're going to have a lot of sourcing. And previously, it didn't really pass the sourcing test. There weren't enough students. It wasn't clear that it was probably happening, but I don't know if we were going to be able to do that story. And in this case, I made it difficult for them, to be honest. This is obviously, as a journalist, if we can avoid anonymous sourcing, that's a better way to go. You're going to have a more authoritative article. And again, like I didn't weigh in on whether we would do that story or not. I gave some feedback during the pitching session, but during the reporting, I remember them coming in, and this is what they got: the lead authors, and one of them was an editor-in-chief, Ramona Jacobson, and I was basically saying, "Is that all you got? Like, we need more." And one of the things that I made them do is they had to have redundant sources for each alleged harasser. And we had to make sure this was really, it wasn't just one student's voice, and maybe, one student had a case that wasn't quite as strong as another. They needed to have just a bulletproof reporting on that, and they came through. They had strong sourcing, and obviously in the editing of this, it was tricky because one of the scenarios occurred in a PE setting, and we did spend time on this, like trying to figure out. We want to keep it anonymous, but once you say PE teacher, that's going to narrow down the possibilities. And in the end of the day, the interaction and the harassment took place in a setting that we just couldn't not say it involved a female student dressing out for PE, and the PE teacher talking about that situation. So we had to include that. We really couldn't avoid it. And I remember, we were careful in the article not to mention PE too many times, but still, like, we couldn't avoid that. And I think that's kind of was the trigger point that set things into motion. So the article's published. One administrator and assistant principal came to me within a couple of days, and his first response was like, Eric, this, respect student journalism. I don't think this was a hit piece, but, the PE department, I've got a PE department that is really upset. I've got a lot of teachers that are really upset because, yes, there's 4 male PE teachers, and it wasn't that hard for people to figure out that teacher. And there was students that read the piece, and they figured out who probably the teacher was, and they were making life difficult for him. But that's the subsequent meetings with the faculty or with the administration. There was meetings with me before the students came in. That was basically the tenor of it. Like, this article has created controversy on campus. There's a lot of mostly faculty members that are feeling upset by it, and how can we better deal with it? But at no point in any of those meetings was any allegations made that what they reported was false, or that the students had done anything wrong, or that I had done anything wrong. So, I think it was October 31st. So just a couple of weeks after the publication, the principal did call myself and the 3 editors-in-chief, so 2 text editors and 1 multimedia editor, and brought them in. And long story short is, like, we need some more time to deal with these issues. And, they didn't say it so directly, but it's basically saying, you students are making our lives more difficult. And in lieu of that, we'd like a little bit more time to get ahead of these issues. And could you please, we're not going to ask for a week, but can we get a couple days, at least a day in advance? And that's when the 3 students, one of them asked, can we go into the hallway and talk about this? And the 3 of them went in the hallway, and myself, the assistant principal, and the principal sat in the office and waited. And they came back after a few moments, and that's when Thomas came in, and he was the spokesperson for the group and said, "We hear you, that this had a big impact on faculty, that it's created a situation where you're doing work where you'd like to be doing other work." So they got the message, but then he so calmly, and I just remember it so clearly, because I was just blown away by his eloquence, but also just his resolve. Was just, we are not going to provide you with the newspaper, the publication in advance, because if we were to do that, we would cease to be a student publication. And the weight of his words were so clear, and there was no antagonism. It was from a place of respect, but also of resolve. And I was just, I almost started crying then, but I did cry about it later. And unfortunately, the principal said, "Okay, I hear you." And that's when this assistant principal said, "I am disappointed in you," and then spent the next 10 minutes haranguing them for their decision and not understanding the impact and how it's made their lives difficult, and it's going to negatively impact the campus when you do things like this. And I couldn't believe it. I looked over at the principal, and she was kind of embarrassed about this fellow faculty. That was my interpretation. And he finally ran out of steam, and we exited. And, in the hallway, I told the students, I stopped and said, "I'm really sorry you had experienced that, but that you just experienced an adult acting inappropriately." And told them I'm going to go in my office and cry, because at that point, I was so proud of them.
This is one of the things that has always struck me as something that is much more difficult about student journalism than about professional journalism, because you are writing about members of your own community, and you are writing about authority figures who have direct authority over you. The principal of the school ultimately controls your academic future in some way. And also, if you write about the PE teacher in a way that risks identifying the PE teacher, that's just a bigger problem than it is, on a city level or a state level or the federal level. So I'm curious about how you navigate that, even just generally, the responsibilities of reporting on a community and how they're a little bit different sometimes than, reporting on the federal government or whatever it may be.
Well, I think, Megan, you're absolutely right that it is a higher stakes situation, and it is an awkward situation, and it's difficult for students to go to that place. And I can remember one after it was published, a former journalism student came and visited and was really impressed with the article, but she literally said, "I didn't know we could do that." So I think there's a little bit of a third rail aspect to it of, that's a place where you don't go. And I think with my legal case, I think that's what was exposed. There was an administrator who had to face a really difficult situation. And I think principal has got to be one of the hardest jobs on the planet, because you do have these different constituencies that all really want a piece of your decision making. And in this case, your teachers are right there on the campus with you. And it was also a first year principal, and she's hearing from teachers, but also department chairs were loud in her ear. And yeah, I think at a certain point, that was, I can't say exactly what her decision making was, but there's no doubt that she was hearing a lot from them. And I think to your question, yeah, that this was seen as a situation where we do need to clarify these kind of boundaries. Mm-hmm. And that discussion and those decisions were being made without thinking about 48907, this California Ed Code, and definitely not with Section G, the journalism advisor protection in mind.
So 5 months later, the principal calls you in alone this time and says, look, you're no longer the journalism advisor starting next year. You've always been an English teacher. You'll still teach a full load of English classes, but you're not doing journalism anymore. And the principal identified that sexual harassment article and an article that never ran as the reasons for your reassignment. Did you know in that moment, like, wait a second, I have legal protections here? Talk me through your thought process as that's happening.
Yeah, at the moment, I was totally in shock because a few days prior to that March 25th, 2025 meeting, I got an email, and the email, the subject line was next year's schedule. And I thought, actually going into this, that it was going to be a discussion about, okay, unfortunately, due to budgetary constraints, we're going to have to go reduce the journalism program down to one class. And that, next year's schedule, there was no kind of indication that it was about my teaching or anything. And the other thing is that the sexual harassment story was kind of done. I had subsequent meetings about that, and in December we had talked about some ways to deal with that article, and one of the things that we learned, and we're at a school, we're all here to learn, is that the students with the sexual harassment story could have, at the end of the reporting, come to the administration and said, this is the story we're going to go to press with. Can you give us a statement about that? And I agreed, and the students agreed that would have made for better journalism. And I thought that was a really good resolution.
Mm-hmm.
So that wasn't on my mind coming to this meeting. So when she said, okay, you're not going to be a journalism advisor next year, it was a total shock. Like I had no idea that was coming. And no, at the moment I wasn't thinking about Section G, and I was just like, the feeling was I just got fired. I got hired as a journalism advisor. Now you're no longer going to be a journalism advisor. Yeah, of course I'm going to be teaching English. I love teaching English. But yeah, I was just kind of crushed, and just left the meeting and took a long walk. And fortunately, I called my wife pretty quickly, and she's a longtime journalist at the San Francisco Chronicle, Tara Duggan. And she's just like, what is this? What happened? And then she went to work as journalists can do. And she immediately was reaching out to people. And by the end of the day, I've got Section G in front of me on my laptop. And the next day, I talked to Mike Easton at the Student Press Law Center. I talked to David Lloyd from the First Amendment Coalition, and also reached out to a colleague, Paul Condell, who's at Palo Alto High School and had been at Lowell High School within journalism program as well. And they made it really clear that this Section G of this code, which protects the student journalist, the journalism advisor, was made for a situation like this. And one of the problems in that first meeting, I didn't have a union rep. I didn't think it was a staffing thing. So I didn't have anybody there with me as a witness. And a week later, I had this follow-up meeting, and I asked, so based on our meeting, you said that I'm being reassigned because of my handling of the sexual harassment story and the proposed AI grading story. And she agreed. And then I said, well, based on the legal advice I've been given, you are possibly breaking the law.
Yeah, this was what was so interesting to me when I was reading through the court documents, is essentially they were saying, we're Eric's boss. We have the right to change a teacher's job responsibilities, which for the vast majority of teachers they do. But you were saying, yes, but journalists and their advisors have special protections that are totally separate from, how our union contract works, what the policies of the school are. This is state law. It almost seemed like they weren't nearly as familiar with 48907 as you were, and that they didn't, they were quoting policy and you were quoting law, in a way that I found really interesting. But even if you know you're right, filing a lawsuit against your employer is, not a small thing to do. So what made you decide to do it?
Well, I think in that case, being a journalist and having someone try to censor you, it's almost kind of a knee jerk. It didn't take on that level with my journalist cap on. Of course, I'm going to do this. But I think in the end, it was really the students and their bravery and their courage that I saw. Thomas Harrison, talking to that principal in real time. And then subsequently, him standing up and at a school board meeting and a supervisor meeting and defending me, and other students writing to defend me. Yeah, that made it like, I've got to do this for the students. And at the time, what I didn't know, and I think what's important to back up, I think for the legal advice that the principal got is, yes, there is this section in this California Ed Code, but no one had ever used it. So I think, you could think of it as, they're not taking it seriously, but a lawyer looking at this like, well, there's no precedent. This case, other lawyers in the future are going to look and say, oh yeah, someone's used this. At that point is when it became, it was passed in 2008, so it's not that long ago, and it became law in 2009, and now there's precedent. But really, in the end, as far as the decision, it was so clear for the students that I had to defend this, because really the case that we presented, and I had great legal advice and lawyer involved, and just for the record, this was all paid for by the California Teachers Association.
That's great.
I really wanted it to be clear that this was a pattern of intimidation. All right, the first time that they're being brought before this kind of tribunal in the principal's office, and then the second time, 2 years later, and then me being reassigned. To me, it was pretty clear that this was a pattern of intimidation, and in the end, and you could see the reported pieces in the Chronicle and elsewhere, that's what the students felt. Mm-hmm. And that, again, all right, I see a principal and administration, and at the end of the day, a superintendent as well, of just, we've got these different constituencies, and in this case, we're gonna choose and put teachers first, which is, the frustrating thing through, if you read all their kind of responses and what the principal said and what the superintendent said, and it's always, we're doing what's best for the students. And I think it's pretty clear that in most of these cases, that is just not true.
Well, and you got a lot of support from both students and alumni saying this was unfair. This teacher has made us great student journalists, have helped us go on to success in college and careers, some really moving testimonials. And also, you got some pretty harsh criticism in court records, in public records from your colleagues. The defense had 4 teachers, so the 2 English department chairs, plus a former advisor or 2 predating you, say essentially, now the Lowell's gotten worse under his leadership. This is about quality. They went into some pretty extreme detail. They said they misuse statistics, all of these things. What was that like for you to still be teaching and have your colleagues saying these things, that seemed pretty tough to hear, and were also a bit of revisionist history because they weren't the reason you had been told you were being reassigned?
Right, and that's a good place to start. Of that, in the end, the judge who made the ruling, Superior Court judge, said that their their arguments were post hoc. That they're separate from and after. And she said they weren't credible. So I'll start there. Yeah, and I think in some ways that's been the hardest part of this. Is that at the first I thought it was just the principal doing this and kind of dealing with the situation that she described of it being this faculty issue and pressure and dealing with those voices. And I heard some of those voices. I had an interaction with a faculty member. I was reaching out for information from that person, and they basically get back to me is like, I won't talk to you I won't talk to the Lowell until you're gone. So I knew there was some people in the faculty, but the fact that it's an English department, and I learned that pretty early on that a person kind of reached out when they heard about this going on and reached out to the English department and said, what's going on here, and found out that they supported it. So that was a shocker to me. Yeah, and the end of the day, the fact that the English department isn't really on board with student journalism, that they don't really want them to have a free press, and that they don't understand my role is not to tell them what to put in or take out of the publication. And, I think when you read through those documents and their claims, it's pretty clear, and the judge says as much, is that they're asking for censorship. One of the things that they claim is that it's become gotcha journalism. That's one of the quotes. And, first of all, I don't tell them what to put in the publication. So I think there's some kind of ideal that I was steering them in these directions, which is untrue. But the other side of it then is I'm not stopping them from doing that, which is also I can't do. Right. So at some fundamental level, there's just a sense, not an understanding of the law. But beyond that, yeah, it's clear back to this kind of third rail of no, Eric, you're supposed to keep the kids from doing these kind of articles about teachers. Almost all their commentary in those statements is teacher related. And then
right, you're supposed to be on our team. You're a teacher like us, take our side.
Yeah. So in the end, there's basically a cabal. The department chairs rallied, and part of this, what set this into motion, is that there was that proposed article about teachers using AI to grade essays. I always remember that meeting with one of my department chairs. Basically, she said to me that, these students that are coming forward with these claims, they talk a lot in kind of innuendo, and a lot of these can just be kind of, they're just kind of exaggerating, and you got to ask a lot of students, but in the end, she's basically saying you can't really trust students. And I'm sitting in my office and she's telling me this, and I'm just losing all respect for her. What do you mean? Students, they just make stuff up. I haven't had that experience. I mean, obviously there's exaggeration and things can happen, but really? You're telling me I shouldn't trust students, and that they just, are not to be believed. And so right there was just a sense of, there's the rail, believe teachers, don't believe students. And I was just shocked. And that was, 2 weeks later is when I got the meeting with the principal. So it was pretty clear that there was this person needs to be schooled.
So you win the case in the last week of January.
Yeah.
It was a the ruling from the state superior court for San Francisco County is very clear, a very clean win, very decisive. It says petitioner persuasively demonstrates that his protection of student journalists' expressive rights solely caused his reassignment. So there was no ambiguity there. Tell me what that was like and what it's been like since.
Yeah, I mean, it was a great decision to read, and there had been a preliminary decision, and that had been really positive. So my lawyer and my wife and I, we knew it was pretty good news, but the lawyer was really careful to say, sometimes judges can change from their preliminary to their final decision. But yeah, I was overjoyed. But really, the main feeling was relief of like, okay, like this, we've gotten through this process, and we can. There's I can move forward with this, and so there's relief on my part. But then I was just really excited for the student journalist, because in the end, yeah, I get my position back. But like I said earlier, I think this is really, it's a victory for student journalism. It's really makes it clear that students do have these rights. I mean, this case has brought the California Ed Code 48907 to everybody's eyes. Like, hey, these really are independent journalists, and they really do have the right to do this. And hopefully other teachers, hopefully department chairs as well, will realize that that's my job. Like, I have to protect their First Amendment rights. And I can't do the things that they were asking me to do, or I would be breaking the law. So that hopefully people realize that journalism advisors are different than standard teachers in that regard.
So you'll return to your position as advisor in the fall?
Making a change mid-semester would have had a lot of impact on students and teachers. So yeah, it made sense for everyone. But the real victory there is that they have lost their right to appeal. One of the things I'm heartened by, though, is that the students have continued to do really strong journalism. And in the end, they weren't intimidated. And I think that really bears truth. Just a few weeks ago, the students did a follow-up piece on a San Francisco Chronicle article about a math teacher who was acting inappropriately and using fat shaming and sexually charged ideas to teach his math class. And, that was a big story. And that person was put on leave. And the thing is, the students did a follow-up article in which they did more reporting. And the reporting showed that this wasn't only just taking place in the classroom, that this teacher had allegedly reached out to students over social media. And Jill
Which
Tucker,
the Chronicle had not reported.
Exactly. And then, Jill Tucker, the Chronicle reporter, education reporter, in her subsequent piece picked up on that and mentioned the Lowell's reporting about that. And the next day he resigned. So that made it really clear that the students weren't cowed, and that they realized that, hey, this is our institution and we can do the reporting and we have sources, and this is not just about what he's writing on the board. This is about what he's doing his conduct outside of class. And yeah, I couldn't be prouder of them. And yeah, it's not about telling them to go after teachers. And, again, at the end of the day, that initially the Lowell administration didn't accuse us of doing hit jobs. So it's a real shame that went through this process, and it was a big waste of money. I mean, the district, in addition to their regular counsel, they hired a really fancy Sacramento lawyer, and who knows how much money they spent on that person. So, think about putting students first and budgets, and like, come on. But hopefully the students realize their rights clearer, and then other journalism advisors can hopefully see that, okay, maybe they could stand a little more securely in their positions in the future.
Okay, secret message to the staff of the Lowell. Eric, don't listen. File a FOIA request to figure out how much your school district spent fighting this lawsuit, because I want to know the answer. Eric, thank you so much for joining us. Yeah. This has been such a fascinating conversation, and long live student journalism.
Hear, hear. Thank you. It's been a pleasure.
Thanks for listening. The Kicker is a production of the Columbia Journalism Review. I'm your host, Megan Greenwell, and our producer is Amanda Dara. We'd love if you liked and subscribed to The Kicker wherever you get your podcasts. We'll talk to you in 2 weeks.